So land tenure in Louisiana's sugar landscape. Really, the point of what I want to talk about here is some of the long-term relationships to agriculture historically and today, and how that kind of affects our understanding of past environments, like the environments in which native communities were utilizing and living in, as well as some of how the changing archaeological heritage is traced through things that have nothing to do with the archaeological sites, but rather to do with how we manage water. So, uh, without further ado, I always like to, when I talk about sugar landscapes, I always like to kind of start with some vignettes of what it was like for the, peak sugar milling season, particularly in the middle of the 19th century. So, for most of southern Louisiana, we have levees lining the Mississippi River, and you see smoke raised above the levees, while enslaved men were moving large barrels called hogsheads. These are 55-gallon barrels into steamboats at the wooden and earthen docks along the Mississippi River levees. Then, if you look back from the levees during the day, you see there's men and women working in groups, cutting cane down to the stubble and loading them on the carts that were traveling about three-quarters of a mile to the closest sugar house, which each were pretty unique to the specific plantations. Beyond this, have several small towns along the Mississippi River, particularly near Louisiana's former capital, Donaldsonville, which is south of Baton Rouge. You have a lot of small communities such as Bayagula, White Castle, where you have enslaved men, young enslaved men, going and lighting street lamps, these oil street lamps to kind of light the sky as the sun begins to set. And you see the plumes of smoke kind of creating this horizon, just this strange horizon, amidst the setting sun. So while these are kind of brief, these kind of demonstrate the importance of agro-industrial production in this like burgeoning capitalist society that's, for the most part, is all centered around sugar, sugar agriculture and sugar. But it wasn't always just about sugar in the 19th century. As different kinds of laws were set in place, you have rice and cotton and corn and all these other kinds of crops that really were not traditionally grown in Louisiana that were kind of being utilized in many portions of the properties that the plantation estate owners had. So to create a sugar plantation, the key configuration of plantation infrastructure is very different than that which we're usually talking about. You have to process the crop on the property before you ship it, rather than cut the crop and ship it. So the key configuration of the infrastructure is different in that you have to create a sugar house, and these sugar houses had to basically be centrally located and easy and not easily accessible to ship products, because the immediate the time between cutting the cane and processing is the difference between sweetness and power, like kind of quote Sidney Mintz. um, while a central part of the plantation, these sugar houses do constitute a very separate world of social production. So drawing from our ongoing work at Terra X in southern Louisiana, we consider how vernacular architecture, labor regimes, and landscape construction are these like mutually constitutive processes where historic precedents form the very foundation of the modern social and physical landscape. So, like I said, sugar is unlike other crops in the agricultural South. And to kind of better understand this, I have this organized in terms of like taskscapes of labor. So you have to consider stuff such as seasonal variation, spatial restrictions, and natural resource requirements. So first, sugarcane is a year-long planting endeavor. You plant it really early in the months of the year, right about now, and then the cane stalks first start to sprout in the spring in April. Then they grow very, very fast, considerably throughout the summer months, regardless of drought conditions, as many of the folks who live in Louisiana got to witness last year during a very, very exceptional drought. And beyond that, the flooding and frost are pretty much the most dangerous kinds of potential effects to the crop over time during these months. So within these sugar fields, they're cross-cut with drainage canals and ditches that are part of this interconnected system of controlled water movement from the levee. The control of water is significant here, as it helps sustain soil health while also helping to avoid flooding, which overburdens the crop and then will kill the crop. So as sugar depletes soil nutrients, cane fields often are cycled every few years, where laborers would retune or just basically shave the top of the crop. And they would ship it down to the stubble for about 3 years, and then they would basically cycle a different crop into that field. So then focus planting into another field. As many crops will grow over 8 feet tall or more by the fall, laborers then start the cutting season. While modern technology permits this ability to travel cut cane long distances for pressing, for anyone who has dealt with I-10 during cutting season, I'm very sorry to have to drive behind 20 um, sugarcane trucks. It's it's very testing on that traffic in the bridge. The as these crops will grow about 8 feet tall or more by the fall. They'll start cutting, and then they basically are immediately brought to the sugar house process. And then, the longer that they wait to get this process, the more sweetness is lost out of the crop. So many producers supervise the construction of very centrally located sugar houses where the loaded carts wouldn't really need to travel more than 3/4 of a mile for processing. Enslaved laborers process the sugar cane very quickly, and then, like I said, the time between cutting and cane pressing can dictate sweetness of the product and make or break the profits of the plantation. So the sugar house in its central location was supposed to be make sure that everything can flow with the most maximized efficiency. Sugar house construction is directional. So the factory kind of formalizes a very specific production process requiring discrete labor tasks and job knowledges. So continuity in the use of space within the sugar house expedites the movement of juice as sugar makers are working against the clock. The first room usually contains an engine, mill, elevator, and trough to convey juice that transports raw juice into a room with kettles lining the walls called a kettle train. As the juice moves down the kettle train, there are attempts to add phosphoric or sulfuric acid to level the acidity of the boiling sugar until the sugar makers feed the juice into cooling pans. Once ready, the sugar makers move the sugar into the purgery, where the fresh sugar is packed into a hogshead barrel. And from these historical accounts, the beyond the plan of the cane hill just previously shown, this is basically the formalized layout that um, a anonymous Louisianian of Natchez had brought to the Southern Agriculturalist Journal in the 1830s. And this seems to be pretty consistent with layouts. In terms of shape, though, it's very different. Each sugar house is always going to look very, very different from each other. So in Iberville Parish, south of Baton Rouge, sugar plantation owners drew from various labor sources and structures to increase their profitability. Intermarriage between the Butler, the Gay, LeBlanc, and Laundry families contributed to the creation of extensive networks of plantation water and field systems, cross-cutting an area of the parish on the west bank of the Mississippi, colloquially referred to as Point Pleasant. Drawing specifically from the Butler family, they purchased a property in the 1820s, and from their earliest sugar house operations in 1828, they had begun a sugar plantation. And here you see I've marked the sugar house that I'm going to mostly talk about today, Dun Point Sugar House, which was the Butler Sugar House. The original sugar house was animal powered until the early 1830s when the building was adapted and expanded with a new condenser and pump, horizontal steam engine, and cooling room. And Butler and his various overseers kept limited censuses of the plantation workforce where he documented a range of enslaved laborers, which generally range between 96 and 150 individuals of varying ages between 1830 and 1850. In 1847, a small fire did destroy the sugar house, and it basically destroyed the steam chimney, roof, and windows. There was a lot of drama surrounding the destruction of the sugar house. Butler was off at the Mexican-American War, and his wife and the overseer were having some difficult times with trying to figure out how to manage the plantation, how he had managed it prior. So in 1851, it was finally rebuilt, and they added another wing to the east side of the main building, and then subsequent additions just kept kind of coming on. And we'll talk more about the sequence of construction for the sugar house as we go on. But these all kinds of follow the flows of technology that were going on for sugar houses. So with the introduction of centrifugal machines that helped kind of expedite some of the sugar production, the purgery, so removing, certain kinds of cooling pans, and also, other kinds of equipment like cranes that would help kind of expedite the movement of larger crops. So during the Civil War in Louisiana, Union soldiers held control over the immediate sugar producing region around the same area of the Mississippi River. During this time, many of the enslaved laborers of local sugar plantations escaped and joined the Union at contraband camps that were centered around Fort Butler and nearby Donaldsonville and several of the surrounding seized plantations. With the looming failure of the opposing Confederate rebels in Louisiana, few of the remaining plantation owners began to reconfigure the structure of enslaved labor. For example, Butler, towards the end of the Civil War, very begrudgingly, developed a share system to pay workers. So in 1864, he would give 28 arpents to 14 laborers at $200 per arpent, which is about 0.86 acres. One arpent is about 0.86 acres, with rights to one-third of the profit that is produced on that land. Furthermore, each laborer received about 43.45 for their third of the share of the 1864 harvest, which 1864 harvest was the lowest harvest that had ever been on that plantation. However, as was so common with the postbellum sharecropping plantations, Butler's record books demonstrate this very active way of limiting sharecroppers' mobile and economic freedoms by regulating their purchases and accumulating debt within plantation. Immediately following the war, the workforce dwindled, and many of the formerly enslaved laborers left seeking other employment opportunities. In a few short months, the worker population fell to 33 individuals in 1865, and as a response to the labor shortage, the butlers, like other ancient families, sought to employ Chinese laborers through recruiters that traveled to San Francisco and Sicilians who sought passage on the lemon boats that regularly traveled between Palermo and New Orleans. Concurrent with the labor force constantly in flux, environmental issues that arose from the creation of new water management systems forced static boundaries on the rivers and bayous that contributed to flooding issues that ruined crops. So many of the plantation owners attempted to experiment with other crop productions, now planting inundated back swamps and rice, where field canals were now retrofitted with cypress boxwoods across the sugar landscape. So we had conducted data recovery excavations at Butler's Dunboyne Sugar House, and we fully exposed the sugar house and its associated outbuildings. And as a result, a lot of the findings are primarily limited to the factory and various infrastructural features such as historic water lines, coal trench, and rice looms. By expanding the footprint, we did identify a lot of the internal structure of the factory too, some of which was well preserved, some of which was heavily impacted by plowing and a lot of other flooding issues that were coming from levee setbacks and the Great Flood in the 1920s. And we'll talk more about this alluvium here in a moment. But we found 147 features and numerous additions and modifications made to the building. But I also don't want to just focus on the building. I want to focus on a few of the sites around here and talk about some of the other kinds of unique findings here, because by tracing out some of these drainage canals, we were able to actually kind of rebuild this entire landscape to see how the historic landscape changed the pre-contact landscape, which now looks completely different than the post-contact industrial landscape here. So what to kind of understand how these water lines had changed over time, we kind of drew from a lot of different resources, a lot of different kinds of maps, and traced where the tree lines were. We considered various things such as some of the conveyance records, as well as some of the interpersonal communications between those living on the plantation. And then we also used historic maps to kind of trace out how water drainages were being changed over time. So some of this you see that over time you carry a more formalized drainage pattern. And for the most part, I think it's worth noting too that let me see if I can annotate this. This was the original extent of the plantation. Does everyone see my arrows? I hope I'm not just drawing
Yes,
myself.
I can see them.
Okay, sweet. So this was the original print of the plantation up until about the 1840s, when there was a lot of talk going on, eventually resulting into the passage of the 1850 Swamplands Act. That 1850 Swampland Act is really important to note here because this enabled planters to purchase back swamps, which that's where all these really sensitive cypress swamp environments are. They allowed them to purchase back swamps behind their property from the government, only with the stipulation is that they're going to demonstrate that they will continue agricultural production in the back swamps. Well, as I mentioned earlier, sugar requires a lot of water, but you can't have too much water, and these back swamps are back swamps for reasons. So in many ways, a lot of these back swamps hold former bayou tracts that have just been kind of infilled or heavily deteriorated over time as new levees were being built, because these levees being built over time, especially throughout the 17 and 1800s, began to close off certain water tracts and close off certain sources of water that or feeding them. And so when they began to purchase these vaccines, they took the cypress, they would change the fuel source for the engines here, and then they would extend these drain canals back here. And as sugar kind of faltered, scientists began to experiment with rice and then using rice agriculture here. So you would start seeing these box flumes hidden off of main drainage systems, but these main drainage systems don't actually reflect where a lot of the box flumes are located. More on that in a second. So let's see, get the annotations to stop. Go. No, we're done. Next. So at another site nearby, we had conducted a very, goodness, there is a lot of things on my screen that don't need to be here. Ah, okay. There we are. So we had conducted magnetometry across another site for an additional mitigation that was only a few hundred meters away from the sugar house. It was in the back swamp. When we conducted the magnetometry survey, we knew that this was a pre-contact site, and we knew that there would be certain kinds of features that would extend back into the back swamps, like the Shell Road. Is we had an 1830 map that showed that there was a pathway leading from the Butler's home into the back swamps on a path to the city of Plaquemine. So they have we conducted this magnetometry survey here, and we noticed that there were some very subtle variations in the geophysical data here that kind of were suggestive of remnant bayou tracks. So as we began to excavate this out, we ended up realizing there was a very key kind of color and textural difference to this that related to infilling. After you remove the plowsone, you see that some of these there was a remnant bayou that extended, sometimes up to 1.3 meters deep, and this had materials that were just filled with Native American pottery. And at the site itself too, I think it's probably worth noting that there were about 18,000 features within this 10-acre block. See. There we go. So you can kind of see where we traced out this bayou in relationship to the sugar house, as well as another sugar house here drawn on a map. This bayou does extend further back, as we've learned, with additional phase 2 works here. Sorry, my dog is trying to talk to all of us. And we kind of identified too that there was a swampy area too that was extending about as deep as this. So this is former marshlands. So as time goes on and you start seeing, this is a cypress boxboom. As time goes on, you start finding that the infilled main drainages also contain these box flumes that were kind of showing shifts in where the actual locations of these drainage canals are. And that was this is one of the key things to kind of trace change in time over these sugar landscapes too, because you continue to find these large scars where drainage canals were in the soil. Scars may be a little bit misleading, but with understanding how the landscape, you got to think property lines and field usage will fluctuate over time. The administrators will only allow the purchase of certain parts of the property up until the 1850s. And then there was a lot of broad scale kind of issues with thinking about how we are going to manage other crops in these backswamp environments. As well as digging up and identifying some of these cypress box flumes too. I mean, I took this photo yesterday morning to show you guys today. We're conducting a mitigation at the sugar house next to this that I just showed on the previous map. And the deeper you go, you start seeing there's obvious areas of fill, but there's just continued alluvium here from flooding as water management issues kind of arose. This sugar house had about a 12-year usage period, so we can actually date what this deposit was and what it was related to from the destruction of it. But it's worth noting here too, some of these relate to burning events, as well as some of it relates to just consistent flooding. One of the key issues with water management in Louisiana, there's a lot of local legislation surrounding usage of certain parts of the land from a distance of a levee or using certain parts of the levee for crop production. So there was a local law set in place that kind of managed water flow and how people were supposed to use it. So as that kind of as Southern Louisiana would have it, the environment itself, that's not going to work for it. It's going to just flood, and you keep forcing static boundaries. The silt's going to accumulate at the bottom of the river and just force more water over the levees, which many had found out the hard way in the 1927s, when 1927, when there was a pretty disastrous flood that killed thousands and thousands of people and across Louisiana. So back to the main sugar house here. I always like to offer a little bit more interpretation on the sugar house here too, because it's easy to kind of take an industrial facility at face value. People are going to be working in the facilities, but during the excavation, we recovered, about 5,000 artifacts. Now, keep in mind, this is a sample. Obviously, we're not collecting every single brick. A majority of these artifacts included those associated with architectural or engineering features, such as brick fragments, mortar, gears, and a fully intact sugar kettle. The most surprising discovery was actually those of the non-industrial artifacts, such as ceramics and bottles associated with very general food consumption. So this kind of helps kind of breathe a little bit more life into the people who are actually working in these facilities and laboring in these fields. So to better understand if there's any distinct patterns in this trend, we transform these results to identify any distinct trends that may clarify the use of space within the sugar house. As you can see here, if we think about the placement of bricks, the historical records where correspondence between family members and purchase records help kind of clarify the sequence of construction, we can actually kind of understand how the sugar house itself was changing in relationship to its changing environments around it. So you notice that for first two sequences, I mean, these construction events were primarily due to the fact that the sugar house had burned down. Then following 1850, we see a massive expansion, which is right after we had expanded, the butler had purchased the Baxmont property and began trying to cultivate sugar back there. And I think it's worth noting too, sequence four is a little bit more difficult to interpret here. Sequence four of the construction actually kind of condenses two key issues with it. In 1883, they had changed the water management system, and then quickly learned that the water management system they put in place was not going to work anymore. So this was someone from outside of basically the Gulf Coast had come in and purchased the property in 1883, and they were trying to install this new equipment that would help expedite production, but they made a very fatal mistake. They dug two wells, and with the shallow water table in southern Louisiana, the water would spoil quite frequently. So then the well turned into an above ground. So one of the wells turned into an above ground cistern, and the other well, I don't even know where it is. So there's no evidence for it around the property. And there was a series of water lines that would then run off of that above ground cistern. So with some of the artifacts that came out of this, so some of the kitchenwares and glasswares, oh, come on. There we go. Kitchenwares and it was mainly ceramics and glasswares were spread throughout the facility, suggesting that people were consuming food on site, which this trend is observed elsewhere, but only really once reported in southern Louisiana and taken to reflect the 24/7 nature of sugar house operation during peak milling season. And the brief recognition of this account is significant as the general approach to excavating and working with the material cultural sugar houses is to view these sites as gateways to the industrial significance in Louisiana's development. Which is fair, and in a way, this though elides reality as missing the forest or the trees. So by investigating the footprint alongside its social use in the plantation, a labor kind of appears in the archaeological record twofold. So for a sugar house, the recovery of material culture should largely follow that of the labor pattern. So linear movement, very specific job task, very specific tools that are going to be associated with it. However, with 24/7 labor, it encourages one to consider how factory labor has created unique solutions to basic daily needs. I think I always like to, for those who's never been to the Whitney Plantation, it is a site dedicated solely to telling the story of slavery in southern Louisiana. And the Gwendolyn Midlow Hall memorial there, she has a lot of quotes from WPA era ex-slave narratives. And one that always stands out to me whenever I go over there is one from the formerly enslaved woman Elizabeth Ross Heath, where she mentions that the enslaved community had balls in the sugar house as the location was far from the view of the big house. Obviously, this wasn't during peak milling season, but it's important to kind of show that with these industrial facilities, there are all these alternative things going on that have nothing to do with actual sugar production. So For the sake of time and questions, I want to kind of restrict the rest of the conversation to the final bit of this to the distribution and ceramic tablewares and flat hollowwares. One of the key things I want to point out here, you see that the industrial storage, these are like these really nice earthenware ceramics that, based off the size and kind of the contents associated with them, these are likely containing the phosphoric and sulfuric acids and other additives that were being put into the sugar for leveling out the acidity. None of these were associated with the sugar cones that we commonly see in sugar factories in the Caribbean. So for the tablewares and hollowwares, you see that there's a pretty similar distribution here. One of the key things that actually distinguishes the two is that in the engine room, these were all very much like plain wares, whereas in this area we kind of called the office, which was a later addition. These are more decorated, kind of banded like mocha ware and these kinds of things. Ginger beer bottles too were a very common find in the office as well, which then kind of suggests there's this weird segregation of space going on. And then based off the historical record, we do know that for the laborers that were basically working in this later plantation, because we have this final horizon of the sugar house, for the laborers that were living here, there's kind of this unique segregation of space, and we do know that the Sicilian laborers that worked on the property and the African American laborers very often did not get along, and there is a lot of records of violence. I should note, though, too, that that is around the same time as the Thibodeau race massacre that had occurred not too far away in the Fouche parish. Um, so tensions were already quite high in the region from plantation to plantation. With that being said, that is all I have for the moment. So I will be happy to answer any questions or talk more about other random aspects of this if anyone has any questions.